It had the power, it had the sound, and it had a reputation that made every farmer sit up and listen. The Detroit Diesel 8V71 was supposed to be the future, a roaring, high-powered diesel built to outwork anything on four wheels. But what farmers got wasn't exactly what they expected. Out in the fields, when the stakes were high and the hours were long, the 8V71 showed its true colors, and not everyone liked what they saw. This is the truth about the Detroit Diesel 8V71, farming's loudest mistake. By the late 1940s, America was hungry for diesel power. The Second World War had shown what diesel engines could do, powering tanks, ships, and trucks across the globe. After the war, every major equipment maker rushed to bring that same tough, efficient power to farms, factories, and highways back home. Detroit Diesel, a division of General Motors, had made its name building rugged engines for wartime needs. Now it was ready to take that technology even further. In 1957, they unveiled the 8V71, a compact, lightweight V8 diesel engine that didn't behave like anything else on the market. Instead of relying on heavy displacement and slow, thudding pistons, the 8V71 was a two-stroke screamer. It fired every time the piston came up, doubling the number of power strokes compared to a traditional four-stroke diesel. That gave it a crisp, crackling exhaust note and the ability to rev faster than anything farmers were used to hearing. The 71 referred to the displacement per cylinder, 71 cubic inches. With 8 cylinders lined up in a V configuration, the 8V71 packed 568 cubic inches into a relatively compact package. Thanks to a built-in roots blower, a type of supercharger, it forced massive amounts of air into the cylinders, helping it breathe freely at high RPMs. It didn't take long for the 8V71 to earn its nickname, the Screamin' Jimmy. From heavy trucks to construction equipment to military vehicles, the sound of a Detroit at full tilt became unmistakable. A high-pitched mechanical howl that echoed across job sites and highways alike. For farmers watching the rise of bigger, heavier tractors in the 60s and 70s, the 8V71 looked like the perfect solution. With horsepower numbers creeping higher every year, traditional 4-cylinder and 6-cylinder tractors were starting to feel underpowered. A lightweight V8 that could push well over 300 horsepower sounded like exactly what the new era of farming demanded. It was raw, loud, and powerful. Everything a growing farm operation seemed to need. At least that's how it looked on paper. By the early 1970s, farming wasn't what it used to be. Fields were getting bigger, implements were getting heavier, and the horsepower arms race was in full swing. The days of puttering along with a small diesel under the hood were over. Farmers needed serious muscle to keep up, and many were ready to make the jump. When they heard about the Detroit Diesel 8V71, it sounded like a dream come true. Here was an engine that could deliver massive horsepower without weighing a tractor down like an anchor. It was compact, lightweight for its output, and best of all, it was already proven in some of the toughest industries in America. If it could haul military tanks and 18-wheelers across mountains and deserts, surely it could handle a plow. Farmers were also drawn to the idea of high revving power. Traditional farm diesels topped out around 1800 RPM, but the Detroit 8V71 could scream past 2100 RPM without breaking a sweat. That meant faster field work, quicker turnaround times, and the feeling of raw, unstoppable force underfoot. The modular design was another selling point. Each cylinder head could be removed individually, making repairs faster and cheaper compared to massive one-piece heads on older tractor engines. For farmers used to doing their own wrenching, the thought of servicing an 8V71 in the barn wasn't nearly as intimidating as it might have been with newer, unfamiliar diesels. And then there was the simple matter of availability. In the 70s and early 80s, Detroit diesels were everywhere. Parts were easy to find. Mechanics who knew how to work on them weren't hard to track down. For farmers tired of waiting weeks for specialty parts to come in, the idea of using an engine that every truck shop in America stocked for made a lot of sense. Early adopters, especially in regions like the Great Plains, where massive tillage was a way of life, jumped at the chance. Custom tractor builders, along with some specific models from brands like Versatile, began offering tractors powered by the Detroit 8V71, touting them as the ultimate solution for high horsepower farming. On paper, it seemed like the perfect match. An engine built to conquer anything, finally ready to conquer the farm. But as many soon found out, farming wasn't quite like hauling freight, and the 8V71 was about to meet its match. At first glance, the Detroit Diesel 8V71 didn't seem all that strange. It had pistons, valves, injectors, everything a farmer expected from a diesel engine. But under the surface, it was playing by a very different set of rules. The biggest difference was that the 8V71 was a 2-stroke diesel, not a 4-stroke like most farm engines. In a 2-stroke, the engine fires every time the piston comes up, effectively doubling the number of power strokes compared to a traditional 4-stroke design. That gave it a tremendous power-to-weight advantage. Pound for pound, the 8V71 produced more horsepower than almost anything else in its class. But Detroit didn't just pick a 2-stroke layout to be different. It was a deliberate choice to create an engine that could deliver constant heavy-duty performance in a compact package, something ideal for military vehicles, trucks, and industrial equipment where space and weight mattered. The 8V71 used a roots blower to force air into the cylinders. Unlike a turbocharger, which only kicks in under load, the roots blower was gear-driven and delivered a steady stream of air at all times. This wasn't just for more power, it was essential for the engine to even run. Because it was a 2-stroke, the 8V71 couldn't rely on natural piston movement to clear out exhaust gases and pull in fresh air. It needed forced scavenging, blowing fresh air through the cylinder to purge the old exhaust before the next power stroke. Without that constant flow, the engine would suffocate. Lugging it down to low RPMs wasn't just bad, it was fatal. Exhaust gases stayed trapped, temperature soared, and catastrophic failures weren't far behind. This design also meant that the 8V71 had a very distinct power band. It liked to operate at high RPMs, typically between 1800 and 2100 RPM. Where the scavenging was efficient, the cooling system was effective, and the engine could do what it was designed for: scream under load. Early versions of the 8V71 were naturally aspirated, relying on only the roots blower to move air. But as demands grew, Detroit offered turbocharged variants. The turbo wasn't there just for more power. It helped pressurize the intake even further, improving efficiency and cooling, especially under heavy sustained loads like deep plowing or heavy tillage. Many of the 8V71s that found their way into farm tractors were either factory turbocharged or modified later to handle the brutal demands of open field farming. Another feature that set the 8V71 apart was its wet liner design. Instead of machining the cylinder bores directly into the engine block, Detroit used removable cylinder liners surrounded by coolant. This made engine rebuilding far easier. Liners could be replaced without needing major block work. For operations running engines hard, this was a huge advantage, allowing worn-out cylinders to be swapped quickly and economically. The fuel system was also unique. Each cylinder had its own unit injector, driven mechanically by the camshaft. Unlike modern common rail diesels, there was no high-pressure fuel rail feeding multiple injectors. Instead, each unit injector pressurized and delivered fuel independently, giving the 8V71 an incredibly rugged and reliable injection system, provided it was kept properly tuned. But all these differences added up to something farmers weren't always prepared for. To get the best out of a Detroit, you had to understand it. You had to work with it, keeping RPMs high, airflow strong, fuel flowing, and maintenance up to date. It wasn't a lazy, low-speed workhorse like the diesel farmers had grown up with. It was a thoroughbred racehorse, and if you didn't handle it right, it would break, loudly and expensively. The Detroit 8V71 was a brilliant piece of engineering, efficient, powerful, and modular. But it was never built to crawl through muddy fields at half throttle. It was built to run wide open, fast, loud, and proud. And out in the fields of America, that difference would prove to be its greatest strength and its biggest weakness. At first, the Detroit Diesel 8V71 seemed like the perfect answer to the horsepower demands of modern farming. But once the engines actually hit the fields, the cracks started to show, and they weren't easy to ignore. The first major problem was lugging. Traditional farm tractors were built to pull hard at low RPMs, digging into heavy soil or dragging massive implements across uneven terrain. Farmers were used to throttling down, letting the big pistons grunt their way through tough spots. That style of work was second nature, but it was exactly the wrong way to treat a Detroit 8V71. The two-stroke design needed constant airflow, constant fuel delivery, and constant speed to survive. Lugging it, running it slow and heavy, choked the engine. Without enough air and fuel moving through, cylinder temperature skyrocketed. What looked like a strong, reliable pull quickly turned into scorched pistons, cracked heads, and in extreme cases, complete engine meltdown. For farmers who weren't trained on Detroit diesels, these failures seemed sudden and mysterious. One day the engine was screaming happily across the field. The next it was belching smoke, leaking fluids, and losing compression. In reality, it wasn't a sudden failure. It was death by 1,000 cuts, caused by asking the 8V71 to do a job it was never built for. Then there was the issue of fuel consumption. In an era where diesel prices were starting to rise, the Detroit's thirst for fuel became a serious liability. At full tilt, the 8V71 could burn gallons per hour at a rate that shocked even experienced operators. What farmers had gained in horsepower, they often lost at the fuel pump, and in the world of tight margins, that mattered. Noise fatigue was another unanticipated problem. In trucks and heavy equipment, drivers spent hours in enclosed cabs or wore hearing protection. But many farm tractors of the era were still open cab or lightly enclosed. A screaming Detroit running at 2100 RPM for 10 hours straight didn't just leave ears ringing. It wore operators down mentally and physically. Stories from the time talk about farmers dreading long days behind the wheel, returning home hoarse and exhausted after battling the constant mechanical shriek. Maintenance was also more demanding than many expected. The 8V71 needed frequent attention to stay healthy. Careful oil monitoring, regular air filter checks, injector tuning. It wasn't that the engine was fragile, far from it, but it wasn't the kind of set it and forget it machine many farmers were used to. For operations that didn't stay on top of maintenance schedules, problems piled up quickly. Worse still, not every mechanic was a Detroit diesel expert. Truck shops knew how to work on them. Heavy equipment outfits knew the quirks, but rural tractor repair shops, not always. In some parts of the country, getting an 8V71 properly diagnosed and repaired meant hauling it miles away or waiting weeks for a specialist. Expensive delays that no farmer could afford during planting or harvest season. By the late 1970s, the reputation of the 8V71 in farming circles had shifted. It was still respected, no one could deny its power, but it wasn't trusted. Too many farmers had seen neighbors blow engines in the middle of critical fieldwork. Too many had paid through the nose for fuel bills and repairs. And too many had realized that what worked on the highway didn't always work on the farm. The Detroit Diesel 8V71 hadn't failed because it was a bad engine. It had failed because farming demanded something different, something the Screamin' Jimmy simply wasn't built to give. For all its struggles in traditional farm work, there were places where the Detroit Diesel 8V71 didn't just survive, it thrived. The key was understanding what the engine actually needed: steady RPMs, constant load, and plenty of cooling airflow. And when farmers or builders could deliver that, the 8V71 became a monster of reliability and brute strength. The best example came from the custom tractor world, where machines like the legendary Big Bud 525/50 and even the world-famous Big Bud 747 were powered by Detroit diesels. These tractors weren't designed for small fields or stop-and-go work. They were built for wide-open, high-speed tillage across thousands of acres. In these roles, the 8V71's high RPM screaming wasn't a liability, it was an asset. Constant heavy pulling at steady speeds kept temperatures stable, airflow high, and fuel consumption manageable. Big wheat farms, especially across Montana, North Dakota, and Canada, learned how to operate them properly. Operators would set the throttle, lock it in, and let the Detroit howl across the prairies hour after hour. The modular design that frustrated some farmers also found a second life in these monster tractors. Field repairs that would have sidelined other machines for days could sometimes be handled in hours. A bad injector? Swap it out. A worn head? Pull just the affected cylinder instead of tearing the entire engine apart. For farms that needed maximum uptime during planting and harvest, that simplicity mattered. The 8V71 also earned a devoted following among custom applicators and contract plowing outfits, where running all day at full load wasn't unusual. Operators who treated the engine right swore by its reliability. As long as you kept it fed, cool, and screaming, it would stay alive far longer than anyone expected. Some even repowered tractors like the John Deere 5020 or 4520 with Detroit engines to push horsepower beyond factory limits, though these swaps were aftermarket, not factory installed. And of course, there was the sound. Even today, there's a certain thrill to hearing an old Detroit come to life. That high-pitched mechanical howl cuts through the air like a battle cry from a different era. For collectors and diesel enthusiasts, no other engine captures the spirit of brute force American machinery quite the same way. The Detroit Diesel 8V71 might not have been perfect for every farmer, but in the right hands and under the right conditions, it became something else entirely. A roaring symbol of unstoppable power. The Detroit Diesel 8V71 left behind one of the most complicated legacies in American farming history. It wasn't the perfect farm engine. It wasn't even close. But it carved out a place in the story of agriculture by showing what was possible when raw power was pushed to the extreme. For many farmers, the 8V71 became a cautionary tale. It proved that more horsepower wasn't always the answer, especially when that power came at the cost of fuel, maintenance, and day-to-day practicality. It forced equipment makers to think differently about what farmers actually needed, not just peak numbers, but usable power, reliability, and comfort over long hours in the field. At the same time, the 8V71 earned a fierce loyalty from those who understood it. Operators who knew how to keep the engine in its sweet spot never forgot the feeling of that endless power under their feet. Even today, collectors and vintage tractor enthusiasts track down Detroit-powered machines, keeping the memory of the Screamin' Jimmy alive at tractor pulls and farm shows across the country. The 8V71 may not have been the future of farming, but it captured something deeper. A moment in time when bigger, louder, and faster seemed like the only way forward. It wasn't just an engine. It was a symbol of American ambition, roaring across the fields in a cloud of dust and diesel smoke.